The Game Boy Advance was no stranger to tactical RPGs. 3 Fire Emblem games, Tactics Ogre, and the topic of this video, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, among other games. Before I get too far into it, I want to say what this video is not going to do. I'm not going to compare Final Fantasy Tactics Advance to Final Fantasy Tactics, or either Tactics Ogre game. And the reason why I'm not going to do that is because I've played none of those games. I grew up with Tactics Advance, and not any of those, so I've decided to cover this one on its own, without much knowledge or influence from those games, despite the fact that it was released after all of those. Those games are on my list to get to, so don't worry. I have played Tactics Advance 2, or Tactics A2, though, but I'm not going to bring that up either, since it's been a long time since I've played it. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance was released in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance, as a sequel to the 1997 game Final Fantasy Tactics. And when I say sequel, I mean sequel in the ways that the Final Fantasy games are usually sequels, which is to say, not really a sequel. Both are tactical RPGs and have some very similar aspects to their battle systems, at least on the surface level, but the plot is unrelated and the deeper gameplay and systems are slightly different. But like I said, I'm not too aware of the specifics of that outside of some light wiki reading. The plot of Tactics Advance is interesting but relatively simple to explain. You play as a kid, who has the default name of March, whose family has recently moved to the town of St. Ivalice. After getting bullied in a snowball fight tutorial at school, March and 2 other kids, Ritz and Mute, go to March's house to look at a book that Mute had recently found. At his house, March's sick and wheelchair-bound brother joins them to look at the book. They talk and mention that they would like to live in a fantasy world, like in the video game Final Fantasy. That night, the book transports all of them separately into the fantasy kingdom of Ivalice. Yes, this game takes a weird recursive canon aspect where they end up inside the video game they're already inside. Interesting to point out is that March recognizes the lizard race Benga from being from Final Fantasy, but this is the first Final Fantasy game to feature the Benga, meaning that March's world likely has a video game that we don't have. Getting back to the plot, March meets the Moogle Montblanc, who brings him into his clan. Clans are like mercenary groups that run around Ivalice doing many things, but mostly fulfilling job requests and fighting each other. March's clan slowly becomes stronger and more famous, but eventually March recognizes that the world exists as a wish fulfillment fantasy for him and his friends, and decides that it is best for all of them to return home and face their problems instead of running from them. In order to get them home, March starts destroying the crystals that hold the magical world together, and it culminates with him fighting the Queen of Ivalice, who is actually the entity that created the world from their wishes. My opinion on the plot is that it's pretty decent. Very simple, but has enough emotional aspects that hold it together and give it some drama. The antagonists have a point, being that they are either members of the world that March might be destroying, or are March's friends who don't want their wishes to be taken away from them. March also has a point, as he recognizes, or at least believes, that it is unhealthy to live in a false world as opposed to dealing with their problems in healthier ways in the real world. There are also alternate interpretations that I've seen that view March as a bad guy in the plot, willingly committing what is effectively a genocide just to get home, since no one is sure whether the people of the fantasy Ivalice will remain after the kids leave. The end of the game does seem to imply that the people of the fantasy Ivalice do remain, though it is left rather ambiguous. The genocide possibility is even mentioned earlier in the game at one point, though the characters seem to decide that it's not going to happen or that it is worth it. Regardless of the character interpretation, the plot is well put together. And if you're on the side that March is a villain, it's still interesting to play the villain in games sometimes. And much like my point, that the antagonists have a point in the default interpretation, March has a point even if you disagree with his actions. My only real complaint about the plot is that out of the 25 story missions, several don't connect to the main plot. Most do, but several do not. Let's move on to the battle system, since, as a tactical RPG, this is where most of your game time will be spent. Typically in a battle, you begin by selecting between 4 and 6, usually 6, characters to use. You get to pick any of your characters, however story missions and a couple side missions will force you to use March. The most basic breakdown of the battles is that the characters take turns, determined by their speed stats, and each turn consists of movement and an action. Movement is just movement, with your move stat determined by the job your character is in. Elevation is a factor as well, since each job has a jump stat determining how high a level they can move in a step. As far as actions go, most of the time we'll be doing one of 2 things. Fight, which is just a basic attack with whatever weapon you have, or a job ability. Each job has an ability. For instance, black mages have black magic, fighters have fighter tech, and snipers have sharpshoot. Within this ability is a number of techniques that the job can learn and use. At this moment, I'm going to mention something I like about magic in this game. Outside of a select few spells and spirit magic, which is the elementalist action ability, all magic is an area of effect attack. This forces you to consider your position when attacking opponents, as a misplaced unit could cause you to be unable to deal maximum damage with your spells. There are a few other options for actions that you can choose as well. Item usage is an action, though of note that for most jobs, item is an ability, much like black magic or fighter tech, that you must equip to your character before battle instead of a second job ability. I'll talk about that more later when I get to the intricacies of the character customization. There are two more types of actions, which are related to each other. There's the combo action, which is a special attack that deals damage and lets other units that have a combo equipped join in to deal extra damage, and the totema action, which deals damage to HP or MP, depending on character race, to all opponents. Combos are unlocked for specific jobs using mithril weapons, which are obtainable in random battles. Totema are unlocked in the story for each race. After beating the appropriate boss, the totema action is unlocked for that race. Both of these abilities, combo and totema, require a special resource to use, called Judge Points, or JP. JP is obtained in two ways. One is by KOing an opponent, and the other is by performing recommended actions, which is something I'll cover momentarily. A character can have a maximum of 10 JP. Both actions use all JP that a character currently has, though the difference is that combos can be used with any amount of JP, while totema can only be used with 10. I never make much use of either of these systems, due mostly to the judge points. The rarity of judge points makes me not want to squander them for fear that I may need them in the next battle, even though I almost never do. I like judge points, as individual rewards for defeating opponents in addition to EXP that is gained from every attack, but I would instead like them to be used as some sort of outside currency. So instead of being used for a one-off in-battle attack, I would prefer if they would grant some sort of permanent bonus, like having them increase stats or unlock abilities faster, or perhaps an ability that can only be unlocked for each class by using JP. There is one other factor to the basic combat that can't be ignored, and that is reaction abilities. These are equipped abilities that do something when a character is the target of an attack or ability. For instance, block arrows means that archers are ineffective on a character, and counter means that the character will perform a counterattack after a basic attack. Reactions are basically the only way to interact with or damage your opponent during their turn, so they are important to make use of. Luckily, you won't have to memorize enemy reactions, since whenever you target an opponent, you're given information on them, including whether their reaction ability will apply to that attack. So earlier I mentioned recommended actions that grant JP for performing them, which I'll now explain. Recommended actions are half of a system called the law system. Laws come in two parts, the prohibited action and the recommended action. The prohibited action is exactly what it sounds like, an action that is prohibited. If you use the prohibited action, you get either a yellow or a red card. A yellow card is given for that character's first offense in a battle, as long as it's not a fatal hit, and functions as a warning. A red card is given for the second offense or a fatal hit, and immediately sends the offender to jail. After the battle, punishments are also handed out of varying severity. Recommended actions just give out JP for their use, though of note is that recommended actions are not in the Japanese version. Recommended and prohibited actions are tied to each other and are often like opposites. For instance, if ice is banned, fire is recommended. Laws have a justification for their existence in the story, but they exist more for gameplay reasons. They provide the player a reason to vary up their party depending on the laws of the day. However, for story missions, I tended to walk around the map aimlessly, which advances the laws, until I got laws that don't hamper my best 6 characters. Notably, laws go from there being only 1 at the beginning of the game, to 3 by the end. Laws also get broader as the game goes on. So, while at the beginning of the game, ice might be banned, forcing your black mage to use fire or thunder spells instead, at the end of the game, color magic, which includes black, white, red, and blue magic, might be banned, effectively preventing you from using a black mage in that mission. This provides both an additional difficulty curve to the game, and even more reason to maintain a varied clan. Laws are enforced by the judges, which are these armored men on chocobos that preside over almost every single battle. Judges also act as a slight mobile roadblock during battles. While you're capable of moving through them, you can't stop on their square and they cannot be damaged or moved in any way, outside of during their turn where they'll rearrange cluttered KO'd bodies and move out of the way. Though, when a law is broken, they'll move to a square adjacent to the lawbreaker. Something that is rather unique about this game is that it lacks permadeath for its characters. Many other tactical RPGs, such as Fire Emblem and even this game's predecessor, Final Fantasy Tactics, have it so that when a character is defeated in battle, they actually die and cannot be used in future battles. In this game, it's treated more like other RPGs, where defeated characters are perfectly fine after the battle. This can be viewed as both a good and bad thing for this game, which is mostly depending on personal taste. The lack of permadeath means that riskier tactics can be considered without a second thought. Some may view this as a bad thing, believing it to be necessary for there to be some sort of punishment for risky tactics and defeat. Personally, I like it, since it gives this game a more chess-like feel, where only the current battle needs to be considered, and not future ones. I wouldn't like it in all tactical RPGs, but it feels right at home in this one, which features a lighter world than many other games, as well as a huge number of available battles. I guess it's not technically true to say that this game lacks permadeath. There are a few locations, called Jaggeds, that do have permadeath. These locations are marked on the map with skulls. Any character still KO'd at the end of the battle is killed off and removed from your clan afterwards, and if March is killed, you get a game over and must return to your previous save. There is an upside to battling in Jaggeds, though. There is no judge, and there are no laws, which is the justification for why permadeath exists in those locations. This means that you can use your maximum power without having to think about what kind of actions you are using. Despite my previous praise of the lack of permadeath, I do like the inclusion of a limited number of locations that do have it. In missions that take place there, you do feel the sudden change in the rules of the game, and every action you take feels tense. Though I always make sure to bring a couple of characters capable of reviving allies to make sure I don't lose anyone. When you're not in a battle, most of your time will be spent on the world map. The world map is structured pretty simply, as a collection of dots with lines between them. Moving between two locations moves the world calendar up by 1 day. At the beginning of the game, most of the dots are empty, and as you progress through the game you get to place unlocked locations onto unoccupied dots, with no restriction on what goes where. It's a bit odd that you get to pick where locations are, but in a way it makes sense, considering this is a dream world created by the characters. When you're on the world map, occasionally other clans will pop up and wander around. If you walk into them, it will initiate a battle on that location with that clan. These are essentially random encounters, and their main purpose is to facilitate grinding. These clan battles are also the primary way to obtain the mithril weapons, which is the only way to unlock the combo techniques. There are optional missions that let you get different locations as Clan Turf. Clan Turf reduces prices in towns that are your turf and randomly come under attack, which is effectively random encounters that you're more obligated to encounter than the wandering clans. And the more territory you control, the more items are available in shops. That last part isn't explained in the game from what I remember, though maybe I just missed it or have forgotten. I've talked about it a bit, so it would be good for me to expand on exactly what missions are. When you go into towns, you can enter the pubs to gain missions. There's 5 main types of missions: story missions, dispatch missions, standard missions, clan missions, and turf missions. Story missions are simple. They are always available and always at the top of the list. When you get them, you then go to the area they are in and fight the battle they are attached to. All other missions have various requirements to unlock, including special items, in-game date, and previous missions. Standard missions and turf missions are almost identical to story missions, other than having additional requirements to unlock. Clan missions are pretty much the same, except instead of having a fixed location, they are tied to a wandering clan on the map. Dispatch missions are the most unusual type of missions, though they are very common. When you take one of these missions, you have to send one of your characters out to complete the mission for a certain number of days or battles. The game tells you how likely you are to complete the mission based on the reaction your chosen character has on the mission screen. Dispatch missions don't award experience, but they do award AP, though about the same as a standard mission and only for one character. Some turf missions are dispatch missions instead of standard missions. So, now it's time to talk about the meat of this game, which is the character and job system. First off, your clan can have up to 24 members, with randomly generated members with no skills offering to join randomly after battles. I found having more than 12 or 15 members makes the game annoying to manage, since random enemies like wandering clans and turf attacks, as well as joining members, have their levels set to your clan's average level. This means that if you let too many characters get behind in levels, grinding can take both longer and become more necessary, both to level up low-leveled characters and to get experience for your higher-leveled, more preferred characters. Which brings up another thing about how I play the game, which I suspect is a pretty common method. I tend to use the same 6 characters in every mission, unless there happens to be a law that would make using one of them difficult, in which case I switch to one of my others. My other characters are primarily used in turf and clan battles to level them up and maintain them for their emergency use and dispatch missions. Now that I've gotten the clan structure out of the way, I'm going to talk about how characters actually work, which is really my favorite part of this game. First off, each character has a race. These races are humans, Viera, Numau, Benga, and Mughals. Each race has a selection of jobs that are available to them. Humans are really the most versatile race. They have a large selection of jobs, the largest in the game, both physical and magical. Though since the Numau and Viera are much better and more interesting mages, humans are best off as fighting classes, like Fighter and Ninja. Personally, I do enjoy using humans in this game. The Fighter and Ninja jobs are among the best in the game, and the Blue Mage is a job I love, even though it's not exactly the most efficient job to use to beat the game quickly. In my most recent playthrough, half of the 6 main characters I was using were humans that were in those 3 jobs, which shows that I do quite like using them. Viera are a race of rabbit women, which are designed by someone who really loves his job. Gameplay-wise, they focus on slightly speedier classes and some of the more unique magic classes. Viera are definitely my favorite race in the game, and not just for their appearance. Some of the jobs that only they have are my favorite jobs in the game. Assassin and Summoner both being incredibly powerful, and Red Mage being my favorite job in all of Final Fantasy. Unique to the Viera is that they have the only 3rd-tier jobs in the game, and 2 of them at that, the aforementioned Assassin and Summoner. By 3rd tier, I mean that in order to obtain them, the character needs to have abilities from 2nd-tier classes, which in turn need to have abilities from the basic 1st-tier classes. Numau are large dog-like people that are primarily magic-focused. I like them quite a bit, because they can get some cool spells on their advanced jobs. I don't have much to say about them, though, since I mostly use them for their in-game utility and not for any aesthetic reason. Benga are a race of lizard people. Their jobs are primarily physical combat focused. I really don't find myself using them that often when I play this game, though they do have some cool looking jobs. I tend to just find that the roles that their jobs fill are filled by humans in a way that I prefer. I do like the spear-wielding Dragoon though, which is arguably their most unique job. Mughals are the small stuffed animal race, and their job selection is best described as weird. They themselves are a Final Fantasy staple, though they don't usually get involved in combat like they do in this game. I like the Gunner and the Moogle Knight, and the Time Mage is cool, but better left to the Numau. Everything else I could take or leave. Now that I've covered the various races, I'd like to talk about the specific part of the game that is my favorite, and that is the job and leveling system. The first thing that jobs do is determine your stat gains on level up. Physical jobs like Soldier and Fighter will raise your attack stat more, while magical jobs like Black Mage and White Mage will raise your magical stats more. While you could get very into the game and managing what jobs your characters are in on level up, most people will just leave them in whatever class they're currently getting abilities for and let their stats naturally form. And that brings me to the more important part of jobs, abilities. I've already talked a little bit about how abilities work, but now I'll talk about how they're gained. Individual abilities are learned from equipment, with action abilities typically learned from weapons, and support and reaction abilities learned from other types of equipment like armor. Most weapons teach one or more abilities and have a required amount of AP to learn them. AP is a secondary form of experience that all characters used in a battle gain after the battle. While you can use an ability as you're learning it, if you want to be able to use it after unequipping the item, you have to learn it by getting enough AP. And the secondary thing about action abilities, which really is what makes this job system so much fun, is that you can equip to each character a secondary action ability from any job that you have mastered at least one action from. While you have to pick either this or the ability to use items, I tend to find that having only one character capable of using items is good enough, so most of my characters have 2 action abilities most of the time. This lets you create fun combinations that, while not limitless, can give you a lot of options when playing the game. So for instance, in my most recent playthrough, my main 6 characters were a human fighter ninja, a human ninja thief, a human paladin blue mage, a Numau sage white mage, a Viera assassin sniper, and a Viera summoner red mage. It's probably suboptimal, since you'll typically want to pair jobs that have complementary stat gains, but you could also create mixes of physical and magical jobs, like a fighter black mage, or fighter white mage. There is a touch more customization than just action ability pairs. Characters also get reaction and support abilities. You can equip one of each to each character, and they are learned in the same way as action abilities, just typically with armor instead of weapons. I've already described reaction abilities, but support abilities do deserve a slight amount of explanation. Support abilities are effects that are always active on the character, as long as they are equipped. For instance, the White Mage support ability, Turbo MP, doubles used MP for spells, but increases their damage and hit rate. These abilities are independent of the equipped abilities and your current job, except when learning them, meaning that you can equip them from any job that the character has ever been. While typically the available support abilities for a given job is pretty decent for that job, occasionally you may want to choose one for your character that isn't from a job whose abilities you otherwise want to use. For instance, the previously mentioned Turbo MP can be pretty good on any mage. So if you want a mage that has that ability, but you want a different secondary ability besides White Mage, you're able to do that. The last thing about jobs that I'd like to mention is how they're unlocked. I'll just show an image from the Final Fantasy fandom wiki to help illustrate. A certain number of jobs from each race are unlocked for all members of that race by default. All other jobs must be unlocked by learning a certain number of action abilities from the basic jobs, except the Summoner Assassin, which require abilities from secondary jobs. For the most part, most ability requirements are simple and likely to be earned naturally in the game. There are a few that are a bit less likely to be found, though. The Assassin and Summoner are a little odd with their requirements, as is the Sage, since the Sage requires White Mage and Beastmaster, which isn't necessarily the most natural combination to experiment with normally. To finish this off, I'll talk about the things that really strike me as good about this game. The job system is incredibly customizable, and this sort of customization is something I love when it's featured in games. I often found myself grinding in this game, but not for levels or anything required to beat missions or bosses, but for abilities to make my characters work more like how I want them to. When a game makes me want to grind, and not just have it effectively be a requirement to advance in the game, that's a good mark in my book. Which actually brings me to another point I like about this game. There isn't much required grinding. In my most recent playthrough, I only had to grind at 2 points. Once was before a battle that was a 1v1 as March, and I needed a couple more levels on him to make that battle work, and the other was before the final mission. Every other mission I was able to get through without much trouble. This may be a slight issue with the game in another way. It may be slightly too easy for some people. I don't find it too big of an issue myself, but others may dislike it. It's a bit hard to judge the difficulty, though, since I don't actually know whether my ease of beating most missions was my strategy or if it was because the game was easy in some way. It's also possible that there would have been more grinding, and as a consequence the game would be more difficult if I had done fewer side missions. However, my opinion is that if you don't at least do some of the side missions, you're missing a huge portion of the game. And I think this being a tactical RPG really helps the customization angle. The first is that tactical RPGs typically feature larger rosters than many other types of RPG, with this one letting you have up to 24 characters, meaning that you're able to take far more opportunities to mess with the job system. And the other is that you get to use more characters per battle, and therefore get to use more of the job system at once. Traditional RPGs and JRPGs usually only let you have 4 characters in a battle, while Tactics Advance usually lets you use up to 6 characters at a time. Say, in comparison to Final Fantasy V, which has a very similar job system, you have a lot more chances to experiment with it in this game than in that game. And that's really all I have to say about this. Customization in RPGs is something I really like, and this game really nails it.